What'd you think of the movie?
I liked it. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I thought that Stella...
When talking about a movie with a friend, you get a chance to reflect on what you just saw. Although you may start out with what you liked and didn't like, a more in-depth conversation will take you beyond the surface meaning and into interpretation.
I don't know, I was thinking that maybe the urban setting had a lot to do with it, just because,
I'm sure
you know,
it did,
there's such a difference in people.
It being a downtown and a city, and there being so many different classes of people.
And cultures even, the cultural.
What was it about the plot that made the movie so compelling? Why did it take place where it did? Could it have taken place somewhere else and been as good?
People wouldn't have put you in different levels like they did in that town.
In a country, yeah, in the country, and also I think
the active reader of literature notices many of the same things. The way the elements of a literary piece combine to produce a desired effect is much like the way the parts of a movie fit together. Authors create patterns of these elements and weave them into artistic wholes, into short stories, novels, poems, and plays. Different though these forms may be, they are composed of the same literary building blocks: point of view, setting, character, plot, and theme. Your recognition of these patterns and your response to it is the basis for writing about literature. To help you become skilled at perceiving patterns, we'll be looking at some of the basic elements of literature. In this lesson, we'll consider setting, plot, theme, foreshadowing, figurative language, and symbolism. Setting is an element of literature that an author uses for specific purposes. The setting or environment provides an atmosphere. It's the air the characters breathe, the world in which they move. As you examine the setting, ask yourself why the author chose to place the story in this location rather than another. Does the setting serve a purpose? Does it help reveal the character?
This is the day of the month we fill our bellies with something besides turtle, old sport. The ships come in.
Look carefully at how the setting is described. In Somerset Maugham's short story, The Vessel of Wrath, a distant tropical island provides the background and reason for the incorrigible Ginger Ted to be present. It's also the right place for the austere Miss Jones.
In my, not in my, not in my. Till we come.
Mina, catch him. Pay attention. Start again. 1, 2.
Till we come gathering, not in my, not in my.
Lear, this is no place for that. Cato, you finish it alone and set them an example.
Here we come gathering, not in May, on a cold and frosty morning.
There. Sit down. Now, children, it's good, but not good enough. Once more from the beginning.
The characters develop and the plot evolves within this context. In a narrow sense, the setting is the physical environment, the type of house, the landscape, the location, the climate. But in a broad sense, setting also includes a point or points in time. This temporal setting is often highly relevant. Consider the time period, Christmas, in It's a Wonderful Life.
Did you bring the wreath? Yes, Daddy, did you bring the Christmas wreath?
What wreath?
Was it the Merry Christmas wreath with the window?
No, I left it at the office.
Is it snowing?
Yeah, it just started.
Well, where's your coat and hat?
Left them at the office.
What's the matter?
Nothing's the matter. Everything's all right.
A perfect setting in time for a conflict between generosity and greed.
Come on, Pete, you're a big boy. You can get this star up, way up at the top. There it is.
Another important element of literature is the plot, the plan or the arrangement of the story. But plot is more than just a series of events. Consider the following. A woman died, and then her husband died. Here we have a description of events in the order in which they occurred, but we do not have a plot. Now consider this. A woman died, and then her husband died of sorrow. What is the difference between these sentences? In the second example, we have more than a sequence of events. There is a sense of causality. We have a plot or a storyline because we have a cause-effect relation. We also have a conflict. The husband's natural will to live comes into conflict with his sorrow. Conflict is an essential ingredient in any story. Conflict can exist within a single individual on a psychological or emotional level, as it does in the example. But conflict can also exist between individuals, between groups of people, and between an individual and forces of society, or the environment. Conflict helps reveal character. The chief character faced with a conflict is called the protagonist. Whatever or whoever represents the conflict that the protagonist must face is called the antagonist. Looking again at It's a Wonderful Life, we see that George Bailey, the chief character, is the protagonist.
Or kill it, but I haven't been able to do it. You have been stopping me. In fact, you have beaten me, George. And as anyone...
The antagonist, representing greed and all that George Bailey must fight, of course, is the wealthiest man in town, Mr. Potter.
I were the only ones that kept our heads. You saved the building and loan. I saved all the rest.
Yes, well, most people say you stole all the rest.
The envious ones say that, George. The suckers.
The plot line is made up of events that describe a specific conflict and its outcome. Soon after a conflict is introduced, incidents occur which complicate it. This is called the rising action. Tension and reader interest build through these complications until a climax is reached. The climax is the point in a story where tension is highest. If you're watching television, the climax is the point at which you never change the channel.
You'll get shot. Look out! Daddy, look out! The cat! Daddy, look out!
It's the point at which you are asking, what's going to happen next? How will this all turn out? As soon as the reader knows the outcome, the climax of the story is passed, and the falling action begins. This is sometimes called the denouement, which is literally the unraveling. Here you are presented with the solution or the clarification of the plot.
Come in, Uncle Billy. Everybody in here.
George!
Isn't it wonderful? So many friends. Mary did it, George. Mary did it. She told some people you were in trouble with it. They scattered all over town collecting money. Didn't ask any questions, just said, George in trouble. Tell me, idiot.
What is this?
Like it spread like fair.
Another run on the bank? Here, George. Merry Christmas.
If you choose to write an essay about plot, you need to do more than summarize the story. To write about the plot, you should try to answer specific questions or relate the plot to other elements in the story. Remember, the object of writing about literature is to provide evidence for an interpretation. Simply retelling the story is not interpreting it. Two terms to consider in a discussion of plot are flashback and foreshadowing. Not all stories start at the beginning and progress logically to the conclusion. A novel or play or short story may begin with the conclusion and flash back to the beginning. It's a Wonderful Life began with George Bailey's crisis.
Help him, dear Father. Joseph, Jesus, and Mary, help my friend, Mr. Bailey.
help my son George tonight?
He never thinks about himself, God. That's why he's in trouble.
And flashed back to his childhood.
And here comes the scare baby, my kid brother, Harry Bailey. I'm not scared. Go, Harry! Come on, Harry! Harry! Come on, Harry! Come on, Harry! George, help! Help! Come on, Harry! I'm coming! Help! Come on, Harry! Where'd it go? Shine, Daddy!
Flashbacks may also occur throughout a story, giving the reader more and more details about an earlier event. Foreshadowing is a technique used to give readers hints about the outcome of the story. From the outset, we expect something to happen. Consider the first 3 lines of Gail Godwin's short story, Dream Children. The worst thing, such a terrible thing to happen to a young woman. It's a wonder she didn't go mad. We are left wondering, what terrible thing could have happened to this woman? And we know to expect something strange. Foreshadowing is often more subtle than this example. Sometimes it takes a second or third reading to be able to find clues that the author deliberately placed in the story to suggest the eventual outcome. The most important element in a literary work is the theme. All of the other elements, character, point of view, setting, plot, are utilized for one purpose, to express a theme. The theme is the major idea or central point of a work. The theme answers the question, what wisdom does this story offer? As you know, art forms are often subtle and ambiguous. They offer no quick solutions or easy answers. You will rarely find superficial morals like crime doesn't pay, or honesty is the best policy, or love conquers all in a literary piece. In fact, each reader may interpret the theme somewhat differently, just as you and your friend may have different interpretations of the movie you saw together. And it is possible for a work to contain several different themes. Even if you choose to write about one of the other elements of a work of literature, you should have some idea about the theme. An understanding of the theme is really a prerequisite for understanding any of the other elements. The easiest way to identify the theme is to look carefully at the story's conflict and how it is resolved. Let's look again at our one-sentence story. It is highly unlikely that the theme is about the cause of the wife's death. That is not where the conflict seems to be. Instead, we are concerned about how and why the husband died. Depending on the actual details of the story, the theme could be, to love too deeply is a weakness, or courage, not love, is required to survive life's tragedies. When you think you have identified a theme, you need to go back and check the specific details of the story to make sure there are no contradictions. In our example, if you discover that the husband was upset because the wife willed her fortune to charity, you would be forced to rethink your first statement. To love too deeply is a weakness. You may need to reformulate your thesis several times until it is consistent with all the facts of the story. Remember, when looking for the theme, you are searching for the overall purpose that controls the story. When writing about and interpreting literature, look for specific examples to help you prove your thesis. For example, in looking for the theme in The Catcher in the Rye, you may focus on Phoebe's comment to her brother, "You don't like anything that's happening." You may be tempted to think you have discovered the theme in this one speech. Holden Caulfield doesn't seem to like anything. But with more careful reading, you can find a number of things Holden does like. He likes the music of carousels. He likes his brother Allie. And he likes talking to Phoebe. In other words, without adequate evidence, an interpretation is of no value, no matter how much you may be convinced of its correctness. The elements discussed so far, character, point of view, setting, plot, and theme, deal with the larger issues in works of literature. They are especially important in longer works like novels, plays, and short stories. There are other elements that are especially important in poetry. Contrary to what many think, there is really no sharp distinction between poetry and other forms of literature. Poetry does not have to rhyme or be arranged in stanzas. Some novels and even parts of the Bible are poetic, while a verse that begins, "Roses are red, violets are blue," is not. Poetry is simply the most condensed and most concentrated form of literature. It says the most with the least number of words. Because wording and language are so important, one way to understand literature, especially poetry, is to look at the language itself. For example, what picture comes to your mind with the words cotton candy, roller coaster, hot dogs, and sawdust? Probably a fair or circus. Now what do you picture? Leaky faucet, cracked plaster, bare light bulb, and a for sale sign. An old house in disrepair? In neither example was the name of what was being described mentioned, yet a picture or image probably appeared in your mind. When particular words or descriptions form mental pictures, the writer is using imagery. By using words that appeal to your imagination, writers can make the work more vivid. Take Robert Browning's poem, Meeting at Night, for example. A tap at the pane, the quick, sharp scratch and blue spurt of a lighted match. A vivid picture of a simple event. Tennyson's poem, The Eagle, is built almost entirely around images.
He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls.
This language is more than descriptive. It causes our imaginations to participate in the event by producing pictures in our minds. Just as we do when we sit by a fire and conjure up images from the open flames. A piece of burning wood turns into an animal. A flame becomes a face. Some of the same processes are at work when a writer uses figurative language. Notice that the last line in Tennyson's poem contains the same type of comparison.
And like a thunderbolt, he falls.
A comparison of two unrelated objects. Using the words like or as is called a simile. This kind of comparison is effective because you must make the connection yourself. Another type of figurative language is metaphor. Here an author equates one thing with another without the words like or as. We all use metaphors in our everyday language. For example, youth is the springtime of life, or all the world's a stage. These are simple one-line comparisons. But a poet or writer of fiction may use an entire story to stand as a metaphor. Take William Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily, for example. On the surface or literal level, this is a story of a woman who poisons her lover and keeps his body in a room of her house. On another level, the entire story may be interpreted as a metaphor for the decline of the South after the Civil War. The use of symbolism is another way for writers to give their works deeper levels of meaning. A symbol is simply anything that stands for something else. It is something that means more than what it is. A rose, for example, has long been accepted as a symbol of love. Our daily lives are filled with symbolism. What did these symbols bring to mind? Image, metaphor, and symbol, all important elements in literature, may shade into each other and sometimes work simultaneously. Recognizing symbols in literary works requires careful reading and some common sense. Symbols become important only after you fully understand the story or poem on a literal level. If a particular object, action, or character is repeatedly mentioned and seems to suggest a dimension beyond the literal, test it by looking for additional meaning. Many elements, subtleties, and variations can be found in literature. This lesson has covered only a few. When reading and writing about literature, look for the elements we've discussed. Ask yourself those important questions and look for evidence to support your ideas. Here are some suggested techniques to keep in mind when writing. Mention the literary work and its author in the first paragraph of your essay. As a courtesy to your reader, give enough information about the work to let the reader know what you are writing about, but avoid plot summary. Use literary present tense. The work may have been written in the past, but in one sense, it is always in the present. For example, we say that Huck Finn is a backwoods boy, not that he was. Write about characters and events as if they are just happening. Since they are frozen in time by having been written down, in a way, they are always present. Refer to specific details of the work to provide evidence for your thesis, and always show how your evidence develops your thesis. The thesis is the constant that runs all the way through your paper. The examples will draw upon certain parts of the work of literature, but they will always return to the thesis. So you see, writing about literature is not terribly different from writing for other fields. The information you draw upon is different, but the skills for good writing are much the same. Express yourself clearly, be concise, and choose your words carefully. Above all, be an active reader and look for those connections.
To gain practice in identifying a plot line, let's look at the familiar children's story, Jack and the Beanstalk. Beginning situation. A young boy, Jack, lives at home with his widowed mother. There is little food and no money for the poor family. The family cow is their most valued possession. When the cow stops giving milk, Jack's mother asks him to take the cow into town to sell. Complicating events. On the way into town, Jack meets a man with magic beans. The man offers to trade his beans for the cow. Jack accepts the offer and returns home. Jack's mother is angry with the trade and believes that Jack has been cheated. In her anger, she throws the beans out the window. Jack and his mother go to bed hungry. During the night, as they sleep, the beans begin to grow. Conflict. When Jack awakens, he discovers the giant beanstalk and immediately decides to climb it. He climbs and climbs until he reaches the clouds. Here, he finds a long road going to a large house. He knocks at the door of the house and asks for food. A very large woman gives the hungry boy breakfast, but before he has finished eating, her husband, who is an ogre, is heard approaching. Jack hides in the kitchen while the giant eats breakfast. Following breakfast, the giant asks for his bags of gold. He counts his money until he begins to fall asleep. Once he is asleep, Jack quietly takes a bag of gold and returns home by way of the beanstalk. Jack and his mother live well for a while. Conflict. When the gold is gone, Jack climbs the beanstalk again and returns to the giant's house. Again he has breakfast and hides when the giant appears. Following his breakfast, the giant asks for the hen that lays the golden eggs. The giant watches the hen lay eggs until he falls asleep. Jack takes the hen and returns home. Conflict. Although Jack and his mother are living well, curiosity gets the better of Jack, and he decides to climb the beanstalk again. He returns to the house and hides as the giant eats his breakfast. The giant calls for his magic harp. He listens to the harp's music until he falls asleep. Jack takes the harp and begins running out the door. Climax. The harp begins calling to the giant. The giant awakens and begins chasing Jack. Jack rushes to the beanstalk with the giant in pursuit. As he descends the beanstalk, Jack calls to his mother to get the axe. When finally at the bottom, Jack begins chopping down the beanstalk. Denouement. The giant falls to his death. Jack shows his mother the harp. Now in possession of both the magic harp and the hen that lays the golden eggs, Jack and his mother are able to live well and are said to have lived happily ever after. Select the word or phrase that most closely matches the following statements. The chief character faced with conflict is called the protagonist. In the story Jack and the Beanstalk, the protagonist or the main character facing conflict is Jack. Whoever or whatever represents the conflict in a story is the antagonist. The antagonist represents the conflict that the protagonist must face. In Jack and the Beanstalk, the antagonist, of course, is the giant. All elements of a literary work, character, point of view, setting, and plot, are utilized for one purpose: to express a theme. The theme is the major idea or central point of a work. The easiest way to identify the theme of a literary work is to look carefully at the conflict. When looking for theme, you are searching for the overall purpose that controls the story. A literary technique which provides readers with details of an earlier event is flashback. The literary technique which gives readers hints about the outcome of a story is foreshadowing. Something which stands for something else and means more than what it is called a symbol. A rose is a symbol of love. In religious ceremonies, water is symbolic of eternal life. An owl is a symbol of wisdom. A comparison of two dissimilar things using the words like or as is known as a simile. As pretty as a picture is an example of a simile.